Thank you for coming to the Hackney History Festival and getting up early and coming to hear about bird keeping in Hackney and East London. Show of hands, please. Who are the bird keepers in the room? Oh, I think that's zero. Actually, I thought I'd invited a bird person who has a canary. She's not here because I was hoping there'd be like one hand, but it doesn't matter because that allows me to make the point that in the olden days, when Henry Mayhew was writing about the London poor and street people and street trades, he found in 1851 that there were more birds being sold on the street than there were dogs, which is kind of interesting in that, well, it's interesting in a number of ways. One is if he wants to buy a pet, I don't know, so he wanted to buy a dog or a cat or a bird, you had to go to a street market. There were no pet shops. But it's also interesting to me because he says birds were bought by the most respectable types, and then he lists a whole load of people, but they're more respectable types than dog owners. So that's kind of interesting because I think we've lost track of the fact that birds were the most common and the first London pet, actually. And what I'm interested in my research is thinking about how city folk look for contact points with the natural world. And often it seems that the sort of most magical elements, the really exciting things, like a bird, a wild thing in a cage, can satisfy a need, which I'm still sort of investigating what that is. And it feels a bit remote today, but as we look at the 1850s and move through to the 1950s, that's quite a coherent period when people really do like these things. And even today, there's lots of birds around, even though there's nobody in this room that has one. Although I'm thinking of having one. So maybe we can talk about that later. I'm going to talk for 30 minutes. You've got a 50-minute slot, so I want a bit of time so you can tell me what you think. I will argue while we're looking at John Nass's wonderful rendition in 1945 of a lady enjoying, you know, the natural world in her home. This is why I like this. Yeah, there's a cat, there's a canary, there's all sorts of interesting plants which we kind of recognize, Christmas cactus and blah, blah, blah. And she seems very content. So I'm going to argue that in the Victorian period and up until today, all kinds of people brought birds into their homes. Because a wild bird was exciting, was a sort of buzz of energy that you could own. Ownership's very important. Contain and control. In a way, it's the car with a dog or cat. They run around. Bird in cage is a very specific sort of entity. And also because they made very good companions, often because they sang. And we'll talk about songbirds, because singing out seems to do things to people, seems to cheer them up. It suggests the bird's happy. That's nonsense, actually. Singing birds are not happy in cages. But never mind. That's how it feels. So there's three parts to today, please. Going to talk about a gentleman called Shirley Hibberd who lived around Clissold Park area in the leafy suburbs, and he had a fabulous array of all sorts of stuff. This is the 1850s. I'm going to talk about singing matches, a working class tradition in pubs in actually all over London, but I'm going to focus on the Shoreditch Club. And then talk a bit about budgies and probably not very much about canaries at all. But just here we can see a sort of trajectory of different kinds of species. Foreign, imported, exotica, if we can say that, up until canaries, which are still imported. And the singing matches actually are with all sorts of basic birds like chaffinches and goldfinches, birds that are around in Victoria Park, and you can catch them, put them in a cage and get them to do some work. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about. I see all of these sort of strands of the story as kind of complicated love affairs. Love affairs have all sorts of contradictions running through them. That's why I find them interesting. Okay, so to talk about Shirley Hibberd and his menagerie, if you like. So he's born in 1825 in Stepney, but he spends most of his working life in and around Clissold Park. I think if we look at the next slide, we can see This is Lordship Terrace. That central, well, the lovely villa is his place. And he's notable because he's one of the first urban gardeners. So or a city gardener, and he has all sorts of interesting things that he wants aspirant middle classes and others. He wants to encourage them to sort of make their gardens beautiful and also protect them from London pollution. So he has ideas about putting a glass bell jar over your favourites to keep the soot off. This is a genuine proposition, so it tells us something about the filth that was raining down in gardens and covering leaves. And he has other ideas about bringing ivies, which are sort of new, into the garden, because again, they're quite resilient, or, promoting plane trees. As we know this sort of feels like a bit of an urban myth, but he talks about the fact that plane trees are really tough and they're resistant to pollution. So this is who he is. He's a gardener, but one of the really interesting things about him, I think, is that he starts to change his attention, well, it's interesting for me, changes his attention from the garden to the home and a sort of interior design. And then he starts to think about how we can bring the outdoors indoors. This concept I find fascinating. So what he does is he sets himself up as a kind of domestic tastemaker, which to me seems like quite a modern thing to pitch yourself as. And he publishes this rather fantastical volume, Rustic Adornments for Homes of Taste. There's quite a lot going on there, right? Adornments. Everything in this book is an adornment. And we can spend a little bit of time just looking at that rather beautiful scene that looks to me as if it's kind of, Italy or something. Doesn't look like Stoke Newington. It doesn't really look like London. But it does reflect a lot of his passions about bringing all sorts of ferns and other plant species into the house and containing them in this lovely new material called plate glass. So he likes Wardian cases, he likes aquaria, he likes saltwater fish, freshwater fish, he likes to keep snails, all this stuff. You kind of wonder how he could possibly keep track of it all, but him and his unnamed wife, who is occasionally kind of, there's a suggestion of the wife in Rustic Adornments, was quite a chunky book on, how to make your house amazing. This is, and how to make it beautiful. And the most beautiful thing for Shirley Hibberd is the natural world. So it's simply not good enough to leave it in the garden. It has to be close. It has to be indoors. Okay, so this is a suggestion for an entrance hall. I don't know if that's a stuffed anaconda or something on the coat rack. Let's assume it is. But and look at the size of the aquarium. So he's really excited. Sometimes you read this and you think he's mad. He never had any of this stuff. I'm not really bothered whether he did or he didn't. The point is that people like this book. It stayed in print for 40 years, and it spoke to people about the way they could live and the way they could sort of transform their interiors. I think the next slide. Okay, so this is the section on, he calls them chamber birds. Chamber birds, as if these birds were born to be indoors. Yeah, there's a term, cage birds, which again suggests that. There's a term that's used throughout the Victorian period. But chamber birds. Shirley Hibberd lists dozens of wild British birds that you can keep. I mean, it's as if you can keep anything. So he lists robins, blackbirds, goldfinches, skylarks, even the sort of fabulously mysterious nightingale can be kept at home in a cage, according to many, including Hibberd. I mean, the reality is that nightingale lasts a matter of months before it dies, but you can buy another one and go down the market and buy another one. So it doesn't really matter, except nightingales are expensive. But there must be a disappointment because a nightingale, which I was actually just listening to in Essex the other day, they sing fabulously, but they can't have been doing much exuberant singing once trapped in a front room, even if it was a glorious front room like Hibberd was suggesting his was and others could have. Yeah, so this book, to me, in terms of the way he lists birds as kind of consumable objects, suggests a sort of new way of thinking about shopping culture. You can have whatever you want. And he's very excited about this sort of modern London society that he feels he's part of shaping, which is very much, birds are a bit like anything else. You can buy them, you can have them, and then when they're not around anymore, you can have some more. Now, Shirley Hibberd is worried about his passion. He's a bit worried about keeping birds. So you can tell from the way I'm presenting this that I'm wanting to provoke a thought about, is it okay? And he's absolutely convinced, and he writes it down, that it's not okay. You shouldn't do it. You shouldn't be keeping birds, really, because they're the most fabulous things we have around us. And in particular, you must not ever take a British songbird from the garden or from the park or wherever else you could catch them and bring them indoors. But he says he can make an exception for himself because he cares for them and he nurtures them, etc., etc. And I'm not picking on Shirley Hibberd because bird literature, of which it is really growing at this point, makes the same point over and over again. So Beeton, Mr. Beeton, father of the kind of publishing empire, Mrs. Beeton's domestic manual, he has a book which is exactly like a kind of, it's like one of those old shopping catalogs, where you can phone up and get stuff. It's just chock full of everything you can possibly imagine. And Beeton, like Hibberd says, you shouldn't do it. Particularly he's addressing young boys who go off and collect eggs and things. Shouldn't do it. And then he explains how you can do it, how you can catch birds, etc., etc. So these lovely paradoxes about being absolutely certain there's a moral question, but allowing oneself to do it because it feels good, I think. We'll get on to this idea that it feels good. So, yeah, he excuses himself because he cares for them. These are his words. So well, it can make them happy. He can make his birds happy. They certainly make him happy. And I'll show you some of his euphoria in a second. Yeah, he talks about birds as the emotional heart of the home. And he writes that his birds were the family we have reared. Which is why I call this whole talk about families, this notion of happy family. I think birds often seem to be completing a family. In his case, he doesn't have any children. As I mentioned, there's an unnamed wife lurking around in the pages of his writings. But I think, these birds might be something to do with his, they might be his children. They certainly constitute a large family. At one point, he owned 13 parrots and 2 toucans. This is not a kind of cumulative total. He had all of those in his house at one time. There's a vast family. It's kind of impossible to imagine how they could have been looked after. Some are caged with a padlock, because parrots in particular are very ingenious and intelligent things, and they can get out, and they do get out. So he has the padlocked up. Others just kind of gambol around, poo everywhere. These are very messy birds. Toucans are incredibly messy. So I'd like to imagine Hibberd and his wife sort of scuttling around trying to keep, a home which we can sort of imagine they're trying to create clean and tidy. They're also incredibly destructive. So the ones that are out are chewing on furniture, nibbling away at upholstery, eating the hooks. So hard to imagine just how it played out. But he wants to paint this picture. You may wonder, where do you buy birds like this? Yes, there's a place called Jamracks on the Radcliffe Highway. You can buy literally anything. Because remember, the Port of London was bringing in species from all over the world. Alligators, Bengal tigers, which sometimes escape from this Jamracks emporium. And you can buy other stuff. And certainly the kind of stuff that, certainly the kind of species that Shirley Hibberd favours. Actually, his favourite dealer of birds is in Leicester Square, the gentleman called Mr. Hawkins, who sells here the birds he likes. However, I'm not at all sure that Shirley Hibberd knows what he has in terms of, where these things come from around the world, because they come from all corners, beyond the empire, the British Empire, really. So let's just look at this. Toucans come from Brazil. He has 3 cockatoos from Australia, including, let's have a look, including a sulphur-crested. So this is a sulphur-crested cockatoo. Fantastic thing where they get excited. that crest goes whoop. They're from Australia. He has 2 lorikeets from Indonesia or perhaps New Guinea. He has 3 green parrots from India, and he also has one of those ring-necked parakeets, which today we see flying all over the place, making a lot of noise and upsetting everyone. Too noisy, too foreign, etc. So it's not impossible to imagine that somebody like him released one of these, or it escaped, and is part of the sort of progeny, the ancient history of what we see around us today. He has 2 azure and vermilion macaws from South America. These things are literally this big. They live for about 50 years plus. So it's a really big undertaking, big commitment. It's not like having a cat that lives for 10 years. He has a very talkative African grey called Old Pole. We'll hear from Old Pole. Has anyone seen an African grey? They're much smaller, like this. They're fantastic things. I mean, shouldn't be in cages probably, but they're fantastic things. There used to be a guy before COVID who ran a taxi black cab repair shop, and he had one outside, and it mimicked all of the sounds of, you know, slipping clutch and hammer, you know, metal hammers. So they're great mimics. Once they pick up a swear word, you've had it. They absolutely understand that's a really exciting word. You cannot get it out of their system, apparently. And you know, you can buy them for, what does that say? 650 is cheap, maybe £1,000, maybe £2,000. But they're on the market today. If you want to go home today and do some shopping, they're there online. Oh yes, and Hibberd has 40 British songbirds up in the attic. These are the things he says must leave them in the wild so that everyone can appreciate their singing. I sound like I'm criticizing him. I am, of course, a bit, but I think what's more fascinating is the fact that he absolutely has to have these things. He can have them, he does have them, and he loves them, and they're part of his home permanently. I think this is a really interesting phenomenon. So Hibberd writes about these birds as if they were his friends. In the evening after a busy day, he liked to sit with them while they chatted away. They're good company. He believed that keeping such beautiful things and looking after them cultivated in people the virtues of kindness, compassion, and love. And he believed that the birds themselves would prosper. He puts it like this: my birds prosper in the shelter and tendance that our love and care have provided them. Which basically means they're happy in captivity and under his sort of management. Let's have a little snippet of his, the way he talks about this stuff. I'll read this, don't worry. He's very excited. You know, he's showing off here. So, we are just now ready for breakfast, and we sit at the fire surrounded with cockatoos, macaws and parrots. All the voices of the animal world salute and deafen us. Old Pole, pet of the parlour, can bark, growl, bleat, purr or whistle, and in addition ask for everything she wants and for many things she does not want. She can be insolent or polite, and as a result of our teaching, she is a very expert thief. I could tell you 100 anecdotes about that one patriarchal parrot. How she takes tea from a spoon and beer from a tumbler, how she cracks nuts and crows like a cock, how she leaves her cage to steal fruit or sugar, how she can recite 2 complete stanzas of Johnny Gilpin, which is a popular tune, and bandy small talk with anyone. So, sounds a bit bonkers and a bit chaotic, but I don't think Shirley Hibberd and men of his kind would tolerate sort of disorder at the breakfast table. And he starts to make it clear that he's in charge. He has a firm hand over the proceedings, and when he wants to finish, he says how he claps his hands and silence falls. That's what he says. So he's sort of treating these birds as if they're cheeky children. They kind of are his cheeky children, I would say. And he has a technique for bringing around and training a new bird that he purchases that's not eating or not cooperating or not fitting in somehow, and that's to dunk it in cold water. He prescribes how to do this. You dunk it in, well, you starve it a bit, you dunk it in cold water, and you put it back in its cage, and it dries itself off, and it will then cooperate. So this disciplinarianism, well, I could say, you know, it feels very Victorian. So sort of throw it away as a kind of masculinist, bossy way of managing everything around you. But that's what he does with his birds. Yes, and the reason he does it is because he wants to civilize them. That's his word. He's civilizing these birds. I think what he's doing actually is civilizing them into the sort of the ways and the rhythms of an English gentleman's house. I think that's what he's doing. You know, a bird is a wild thing, and it needs to be sorted out and taught a lesson, and then, you know, it'll know how to live. Even for him, bird cages had to look beautiful. Can we have a look at these? So lots of different bird cages you can have, of course. The one on the left is a metal cage, and yes, that is a goldfish bowl on the top, into which your little bird could even fly and have a look around at the birds. So he says. That's a German-made cage. British-made cage on the right is described as a fairy cage, crystal fairy cage. It's made out of plate glass. Again, this new invention. It's see-through. It has a malachite swing and something else made of red bohemian glass. So it's rather exotic, fabulous thing. You know, we might ask, so who could afford this stuff? Well, I don't think that's exactly the point. I think Hibberd was just excited that these things could be had, you know, in a modern world that allowed nature from Britain and from the empire to be marshaled, gathered up, owned, and showed off. I think this is kind of what he was up to. And he wants, by publishing these books, other people to feel that that's possible for them too. Very aspirational. Okay. Going to talk about singing matches in pubs in the 1890s. So, about half of all Londoners had a small songbird by this period in time. Half. They're more common at this point still, I think, than dogs and cats. Dogs are mostly guard dogs. They're for security. And they're not usually allowed in the home. People have got dogs around, but they're not the sort of things that you allow to slob around on the sofa. Not yet. And cats are around, but again, not fully formed kind of pets. The evolution of pets takes quite a while. The 1850s is the first time when it looks like these creatures are affordable and begin to be brought into the home. But just to give a sketch of who owns what, working classes often owned a linnet or a goldfinch because they're good singers. The middle classes kept canaries and bullfinches and thrushes, as well as parrots. And the uppers kept everything because they could. Queen Victoria had parrots from when she was a young woman. Prince Albert loved bullfinches, German bullfinches, which he had shipped over and trained them up to sing German folk tunes, actually. So, you know, these creatures are, they're everywhere. They're pets. Let's have a look at the next one. Yeah, and you can buy them in the East End. The best place to go is Club Row and Sclatter Street on Brick Lane. Let's have a look at the next one, please. Oh, let's just zoom in to see what a fabulous place it must have been to go on a Sunday morning. If you weren't here, that's where you'd have been there. And people would go there people would show up to the Club Row bird fair from West London just because it was an amazing spectacle. Let's keep going, please. So this is James Morrissey's. He describes himself as a naturalist. He sells lots and lots of different things. If we zoom in, you can see big and small cages, basically. I mean, I have mixed emotions when I see pictures like that, but I think they're kind of amazing. You can imagine the sound. Yeah, we've got to go down the pub. The working class tradition of taking your bird down to the pub, I think, emphasizes a sort of everyday culture. So we could say, I suppose, that Shirley Hibberd's everyday culture was, well, we can't say it's typical. So I guess the distinction I'm making here is that people that, mostly working men who kept a small bird, and took it down to the pub. This is a very much an everyday thing. So the idea of these competitions is to set your bird up with another to sing. And yes, the buzz is kind of sport and the thrill of having a winner on your hands. But it's also about money, definitely about money. It's also about love, because these birds go home, they become part of the sort of family system again. They're hardly documented, these things. So I'm going to share with you, I'm going to read it really quickly. Okay, let's look at the chaffinch. The chaffinch keeps coming. We're going to talk about chaffinches because chaffinches are the key bird that you take down to the pub. They're not particularly good singers, but they can sing in a way that can be marked. And the contests are heavily regulated. There's judges, juries, and people marking, and there's money at stake. So they have to be managed like a proper sporting event, and they are. Let me just give you a sketch of a contest in 1896 in which we hear about an evening contest between two celebrity East End chaffinches. One's called the Kingsland Roarer and the other is called Shoreditch Bobby. We're at the Cock and Bottle in Shoreditch, doesn't exist anymore, and the owners have just handed over their stake of a sovereign to the landlord, who often is the person who's hosting these and selling lots of beer. Here we go. In the parlour, all the jets are lighted, but some have trouble to penetrate the fumes of tobacco, beer, etc. At last, the contesting parties enter, each dressed in his Sunday best. The host conducts them through the welcoming crowd to two reserved tables and attends personally to the wants of the honoured guests. Then, with much noise and unnecessary reiteration, order is requested. Naturally, the various songsters before mentioned, excited by the general hubbub, have been noisier than ever, and now are relegated to the darkness in another room to quieten them. Only the two principals remain. So everybody, what that meant was everybody piles in with their birds, but only the two singing birds are allowed to remain in the room like this. Only the two principals remain closely covered up, so they're covered in a little cloth. The two markers take their places. These are the experts who judge the singing. And as the clock strikes, the two cages are uncovered and hung up. The battlers look around for a moment, shake their plumage, wet their beaks, and one may take a grain of seed, but before it's cracked, he hears a familiar sound uttered by his opponent. Immediately he replies by a full strophe of his song, to which the other answers with fuller power. Before each marker already is a stroke of his chalk on the bench. And now the combat is fairly started. The chalks are busily employed to mark each properly delivered strophe, and they keep pace with each other for a time until Bobby takes it into his head to betake himself of the food trough. Meanwhile, the roarer continues steadily to pour forth his heart and gains considerably in chalk marks. Costermonger Joe is getting very uneasy and cannot understand this trick of his much renowned bird. Never before did he think of food while in the presence of an opponent. In order to draw his bird's attention upon himself and from the food, though, he moves uneasily in his seat and ventures at last to cough out loud. It must be understood that while a match is proceeding, no words of encouragement are allowed, no whistling or any other means may be resorted to. Fair play is rigorously enforced. Coughing cannot be stopped, however. At last, Joe can stand it no longer. Accidentally, his beer glass gets knocked over and falls on the floor with much clatter. Bobby peers across the room to ascertain the cause of this unusual disturbance and catches sight of his master, and immediately he resumes his battle cry. The ruse has succeeded, although there is a tumbler to pay for. The chalk marks on the tables are getting very numerous. The roarer has challenged without a fault for 13 minutes and is 40 points ahead of Bobby, but now feels rather dry. He stops working, takes a drink of water and hops on the food box. But Kingsland Bill does not give his bird time to lose ground by feeding like the other. In a moment, he whips out the brightly coloured handkerchief the roarer knows so well and pretends to wipe perspiration from his anxious brow. His finch takes the hint and gallops through the remaining 2 minutes of the appointed 15 minutes in grand style. Bobby also has tried hard to make up for the precious time, but he's lost so wantonly but could not recover. Although credited with 212 marks, the roarer beat him by 28 strokes. So there's a lot going on. This is a kind of, well, it's exciting. I hope we get a sense of. It's null and void because of cheating. The landlord asked for a rematch next week, so it's going to happen again. Let's have a look at. So this is a chaffinch that's doing all the singing. That's why I've been looking at this fella. This big guy. There are almost no depictions of these things. This account I've just read is extremely unusual because working men did not write things down like that. So the guy that writes that down is a sports journalist, and he knows a lot about birds on competition. So that's why we have this kind of plain speaking account. I mean, what it tells us is the bird cages are tiny. They go on the wall, and you can see here the kind of marquees. So it's a serious sport. And long lasting. I found this happening on Redchurch Street up until the 1950s in a cafe newsreel. So it grips people. How do we make sense of all this? Well, chaffinches are not admired for their musicality particularly. They have this 3-note staccato followed by a little twiddle, a little trill. And you only got a mark if your bird did all of that. So that's the strophe that we hear talked about in that account. So the point of the match is not to sing beautifully. It's about accuracy, speed, concentration. Second point I want to make is that the engine for all of this is gambling. Nothing to be ashamed of. All British sport is driven by gambling. Cockfighting is banned by this point, but cockfighting was a national sport and ran on gambling. Pub sports did, rowing, cycling, dog racing. Horse racing, of course, later football. So gambling's at the heart of it in many ways. So it is about male swagger and bravado, you know, having a winning bird. All of this stuff's really important. Winning a cash stake. But quite often there are other sort of domestic prizes available. So I've read adverts for these competitions where you can get a silver tankard if you win, a watch, a copper kettle, a set of teaspoons. So this there is a link back home, if you like. So my fourth point is it's not all about masculinity and social status, because these birds ultimately are home pets. That's where they spend most of their time. So they're fussed over, they're, you know, well fed. They're hung up by the window for a bit of fresh air. Owners get very, very attached to them, and vice versa, actually, particularly finches, like chaffinches and goldfinches. They sort of cooperate. They seem quite happy. And they become very attached. They sort of bond to their owner, as if it's a, you know, father or a mother figure. And the final point is that it's the song really that's doing the work here. Yes, in the competition, of course, but at home, these are pretty birds, but it's the song that seems to move people. It's the thing they write about. It's the thing that seemed to cheer them up. And on that cheering up, because I think I'm slow, I'll say a bit about budgies, nothing about canaries. But we're now in the 1950s, so we've jumped ahead a bit. Let's talk about budgies. Can we see a picture of a budgie? We don't recognize this as a budgie because because budgies don't come from here. They come from Australia, and they're flock birds, and in the wild they're yellow and green. If we have a look at the next one, that's what these things look like. And they were imported from about the 1840s. They're immediately kind of recognized to be gregarious and interesting to have around and kind of exciting. John Gould talks about, you know, the fact that John Gould's a naturalist and explorer. He says, you know, independent of their highly ornamental appearance, they are constantly coquetting, squabbling, and assuming every variety of graceful posture. So quickly he's like, we could do something with these. George V loves them. He loves the blue ones. Over decades, you can get more and more colors as you breed these things. If you have a look at the next slide, you can see I used to have a blue one, a bit like this, and it flew away, and I want it back. You don't really have to pay 100 quid for a budgie. 25's plenty. They're around in all sorts of lovely colors. What I want to really say is that by the 1950s, budgies have taken over from canaries. I've said one thing about canaries. That's all I'm going to say. They beat canaries, finally in the kind of popularity stakes. There's about 6 million of them from one source who I think is reliable. 6 million budgies in Britain in the late 50s. And I want to talk about Peter Townsend's work. Peter Townsend's a sociologist from Essex University, and he was concerned about what was happening to old people, as he called them, as generational trends and support networks were changing. He was worried that old people were becoming isolated, the children were just disappearing and not looking after them. So he interviews 200 Bethnal Greeners, white working class men, women, married and unmarried, many living alone at this point in their lives. They're in their 60s. And in the process of doing his sociological study and being with these people in their homes, he starts to notice geraniums being referred to, and yes, you guessed it, they're pets. Old people's pets, not surprisingly, were important. More surprising to me is that birds were more important than anything else, pretty much. He finds canaries in front rooms, sometimes flying free. He meets a woman who uses the wireless radio and the bird for company. He notes that birds have often been given by a son or daughter, which I think is interesting. Are they feeling guilty? Mum, you need a budgie. What comes out of this academic study then is, something about the emotional relationships with caged birds. Maybe I won't read that because I want to be able to have a chat and we're running out of time. You can scan that. I think you get the gist that something in this study sort of accidentally revealed a new dimension to home life of the elderly, where birds were actually part of the scene. I wasn't expecting that. Today, birds do people do still keep budgies. I've found this box of Trill in my local Tesco. So I don't know why, when I ask anyone in the room who keeps a budgie, there's nobody admitting it, but people do still keep budgies. Let's keep going, because I want to finish. That's Clissold Park Aviary. I went there the other day. Of course, the aviary doesn't look like that anymore, but it does have about 10 or 12 budgies, fantastic different colors. So something's still happening with budgies. I'm going to finish and just say a final thought. And that is a summary, really, that people in Hackney and East London have wanted to be close to birds. It's not enough just to go to the park or feed them from the windowsill. They wanted them indoors to possess them, make them part of the family. And many people seem to have had their lives lifted a little by keeping a bird in their home, and they still do this. There's 1.4 million caged birds in Britain today still. So it's still a happening thing. That's it. You've got 6 minutes of questions. Let's go. Who agrees and disagrees? Whatever.
You said you had a yen to have a bird yourself?
Yes, I do. This work is...
What would you choose?
Actually, the project I'm working on is sort of working through, can I allow myself to do it? Wine Brothers done it. I mean, I make excuses, we have a cat, so I can't have a bird because of the cat. I'm not sure. A blue budgie, like the one that flew off in, 1980. And maybe that would be a Barney.
Hi, Shirley Hibberd, he refers in his book, as you say, to the fact that can be an exception to keeping birds because he knows how to do it. But he's also written a book which he presumably is because he's encouraging other people to do this. Otherwise, the book's not going to sell, but it sells for 40 years. So there's a slight contradiction. Can you resolve that? I couldn't quite work out. For me, it's that he's saying, I'm the only person who knows how to look after these birds, yet here's a book that I'm selling to everybody where that you could have this life, but actually I'm the only person who can do it.
No, he's not saying I'm the only person. He's saying people like me actually can allow themselves to do it. And, I'm assuming all his readers are a bit like him and they think, yeah, I'm a special case as well. And I think all of the bird literature is a bit like this. It's sort of I mean, it's almost as if they're setting up this sort of threesome. It's like, you really don't want to read this book. It's sort of pornography, and don't look, but, you know, I'm just going to tell you everything you need to know here, and then you can do it as well. It's very strange. And it's, what's interesting about contradiction, it's just in the open air. It's not secret. It's just, it seems to be an admission that it's hard to avoid the compulsion. Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Just to follow on from that point, I'd say it's still quite relevant now, because if you ever look into like wildlife rehabilitation websites and so on, it will always be like, don't do this, whatever you do. However, if you do find yourself with a baby bird, this is how you do it. So it's like, it very, very much mimics the same thing now on the internet as it did then in sort of wildlife. But
And for British birds like goldfinches, there are endless arguments about how a goldfinch has a better life indoors and outdoors. It lives longer, probably true. It doesn't have any predators. It's spoilt silly. You know, the fact that it's probably living on its own and has no social contact with any other birds doesn't seem to be of a concern. But people convince themselves, particularly bird breeders, that birds are better off kept indoors because we should look after them.
I'm thinking of the Great Exhibition, 1851, at the Crystal Palace. The great showcase for the British Empire, but also for world trade. Were there lots of birds there sort of being shown? And I wondered if there was a kind of a surge of popularity after the Great Exhibition.
There were birds. There was a great question. There were birds there. I don't know how much birds were on display because they must have been there. And I've read quite a lot about the Great Exhibition. That I haven't noticed whether there were displays of birds. But I tell you what, the Great Exhibition Hall itself was used as a model for bird cages. Maybe we can just whiz through. I don't know.
And also,
just slides here, but
worth adding to that probably the Great Exhibition was the first place they used plate glass. It had only just been invented, so they sort of bought them. Yeah.
Yes, plate glass is a new technology. Steel and plate glass is very interesting. And there's an example of a cage that is echoing, the Hyde Park exhibition hall.
Amazing,
Yeah. Come on, we've got 2 minutes. You're not going.
On the on Instagram and these, some of the birds that are kept by people do seem very keen on their owners. Yeah, and they do seem quite happy. It's a bit difficult to know
they're keen on their own?
because they nibble their ear toes. Well, the thing is there any way of working out, and also another thing I was going to say is the thing about a robin coming around when you're digging the ground.
Yes.
They have some kind of connection with the human that they've learned, which is quite interesting. So do you know if there's any scientific connection? How can they work out whether a bird does have a relationship with a human?
I'm not too sure about the science, but certainly on the robin point, robins do that because you're raking the ground or shifting the ground, so they're interested in a worm. Exactly. I think that's probably science there. But in terms of having your ear nibbled by a cockatoo, what's going on there is that they're incredibly affectionate and they need lots of social contact. And the problem in terms of taking really big birds like that live in flocks and keeping them at home is that they bond to you and they need a lot from you. So nibbling, stroking, all of that kind of affectionate physical contact is very much what they need. So that's why you see it.
But maybe they're guessing, maybe that's enough for them, I hope. So
Well, I hope to.
there's somewhere in the middle of America living in suburbia.
Are we finishing?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to start to the day. What a wonderful start to our Sunday. Sure, so when we give another round of